already with the style. We've got the Goofus and Gallant thing going on. So
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on this balmy February evening. How many people are here for the first time? Well, welcome. We are Red Emmas. We are almost 20. We started in 2004, so coming up on 20 years old as a project. We are a worker-owned bookstore, coffee house, event space, and kind of all-purpose center for providing whatever kind of platform for intellectual and community engagement with left themes we can make happen. And we do that all largely because people support us by coming to our events, buying books, buying coffee, getting food, ordering catering through us. Soon, when we get our final bookstore set up, using our classroom space to either provide free education and organizing events or to rent it for private meetings. And generally, we try and do all of that in a way that's directly aligned with the principles that we have, which is creating a workplace that looks like the world we want to see. So welcome, everyone. And we have a lot of great stuff coming up. I don't want to bore you with the entire list of events because it's really quite voluminous. I do want to mention one thing, which is that on the weekend of April 30th, we are going to be co-organizing a book festival. That's going to be taking place on Sunday. It's going to be taking place all around the Waverly neighborhood, and in particular on Sunday the 30th with a big outdoor stage and lots of vendors and all sorts of great outdoor book type things happening all day long. So please do keep a lookout for the announcement of that. There's some great folks coming through for that. But tonight, I'm very excited that Malcolm Harris is here to talk about Palo Alto. I am a sucker for big left books about cities. I don't know if anybody else is, but it's kind of a genre, big, massive histories that not only give you tons and tons of detail about how a city came to be, but also tell a larger story, right? A story about capitalism, a story about racism, a story about America, right? A story about where we're going, the disasters we're kind of careening towards, and doing that all through this lens of kind of unpacking how a city works. And this book really firmly fits within that genre. I would put things like Mike Davis's Amazing City of Quartz in there, St. Clair Drake's Black Metropolis, Thomas Sugrew's Origin of the Urban Crisis on Detroit. So this whole series, you can kind of read your way through the history of America through these histories of cities. And I think this book is a real contribution to that. And I don't say that lightly, I don't say that offhandedly. I do think this is a real tremendous contribution to our intellectual armament for thinking about the situation we're in. And how we get out of it. So I'm also thrilled that Osita Nwanevu is here tonight, columnist for The Guardian, contributing editor for The New Republic, really, really smart person, writing a book about democracy in America, which, a lot of people will say that, and I'll be like, okay, sure. But Osita is actually one of the few people where I'm like, oh, damn, that's going to be really, really good. When is it coming out? So really thrilled that he will be kind of serving as an interlocutor for Malcolm tonight. And please join me in giving both of our speakers a warm round of applause.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. This is actually my first time in this space kind of feeling as built out as it does now, and it's just really exciting to be here. I've been hearing about the renovations and the move for a long time, and this bookstore is such a treasure, and I'm just really glad it feels as great as it does, and it looks as great as it does right now. And fittingly, we're here to talk about a really fantastic book, Malcolm's book, Palo Alto. This is an extraordinary book, and I don't just mean that in the sense that Malcolm is a great writer, he is. But in terms of the scale of the thing, the scope of what it covers, it's really, really impressive. I'm just gonna be real with you. It's not like a beach read. It's like very. It's very well researched, deeply researched. He weaves so many different strands together. So many that it was actually kind of daunting to come up with a list of questions that I felt would encompass it all. But I guess we're gonna give it a try. A lot of people are going to pick up this book thinking that it's a book primarily about Silicon Valley as we know today. It's going to be a book about Facebook and Apple and all those things, and it is in large part that. But that's really only the last 100, 150 pages or so where you talk about the current state of Silicon Valley. You go all the way back to the indigenous people who populated the land. You talk about the 49ers. You talk about the agricultural development of the region, the fruit cartels. And that's one of I think the big surprises of the book, just again, how many things it incorporates into its narrative. But the other surprise to me personally was how you start it. At the very beginning, you talk about a string of suicides, actually, of teenagers, I think that's within the last 15, 20 years within the area. That's your entry point into this kind of grand economic narrative. And so I just wanted to start with the start. Why did you think that beginning the book with those stories about teenagers in the area killing themselves, why was that a sensible place for you to start? And what does it say about the larger economic narrative you're trying to weave out throughout the book?
Yeah, I think I started there partly because I really didn't want to. And I was talking with my friend Ann Boyer, who's a great writer. I'm sure you can buy some of her books downstairs. And I was talking with her about what I was going to work on for my third book. And I said, I don't know what I want to work on, but I know I really don't want to write about Palo Alto. I don't want to write about the suicides. I don't want to write about my childhood, because this was the major news event of my childhood. And writers in my cohort, especially those of us without graduate degrees, you write about the major event of your childhood if you want to weave in some historical story, and that gives you the credit to access some larger story that you want to tell. And I really didn't want to do that at all. And she told me, well, if that's your reaction, if that's what you're saying, then that suggests that that's what you need to write about, that's going to keep bugging you, until you write it. It's always going to be the book that you don't want to write. And so when I originally pitched it, the suicides played a much bigger role in the story. I think as our personal histories play a much bigger role in our psychological histories of our place until we spend a long time reading about the history of the place. And so partly it was kind of a therapeutic exercise of reading more about the history, put it all very much in perspective. And if you read the book, you'll see that those suicides are put in by the end of the book when you run into them in the actual historical timeline, then it's in a very global context as opposed to this local personal context. But this beginning of these suicides, which was a national phenomenon, it was the cover of the Atlantic magazine was the Palo Alto suicides, and it was really straight through from when I was a child. And so much of it had to do with these train tracks which run through both high schools, but are also the foundation for the town, right? That was built on the railroad and built by a railroad baron. And so this resonant historical connection between these tracks and the death of these children and this place of wealth and power was creepy, right? It was discordant there as a child, and the more I looked at it, the more it seemed like the sort of punctum, the place to enter this picture of the story.
So one of the strengths of the book is that you take a lot of pains to separate this account from other accounts you might call great man narratives, stories about history where the things that are really important are these individual people who make these distinctive choices, and that's what sort of shapes how things turn out. You're trying, instead in this book, to sort of weave together a picture of a system, the Palo Alto system, as you call it, but also sort of the wider system of capitalism and how it grows and it changes. That being said, there are central figures to this account. And I'd like to talk about two of them. The first one is Leland Stanford. Who was Leland Stanford? And also, to that larger point, how should we think about him? Should we think about him as a distinctive agent or somebody who is emblematic of wider forces and changes that would have swept up somebody like a Leland Stanford, if not him specifically, at some point?
Yeah, even his coworkers didn't think of him as a individual who was making agential choices, which was what makes him such a great 19th century figure. Like I ripped off some of Tolstoy's language that he uses to describe Napoleon in War and Peace, because he does such a good job of describing this guy as emblematic or characterization of impersonal forces in this dude who contrasts with the epicness of those forces with being a relatively unimpressive person. Personally, Napoleon being short or whatever. Leland Stanford really looked the part in contrast. He had the beard, big guy, but was a real goofball. And he ends up as the front man for this group of petty capitalists in Sacramento because he's the least clever of the four of them. And so at a time of really great class conflict, and when they're worried about getting investigated by the federal government for all the ways that they're actually making money, they put forward Leland, because Leland is sort of the least smart. And he gets away with it because he dies at the right time, and the country is going through a lot of stuff. But he ends up the governor of California, not in spite of his incompetence and sort of lack of substance, but really because of it. And so it's funny that he founds this town, and he really does found the town. In the 1870s, if you want to move your family to the suburbs because you're escaping class conflict, you have to create a suburb for your family to move to because it doesn't exist yet. And that's how Palo Alto really starts, is him being the first to move to the suburbs, move his family to the suburbs, but in this very classic, what we now understand as a classical way. And he is really, really a goofball, and they weren't shy about saying so even at the time. Even the other members of this clique of capitalists, never mind the workers themselves, who used him as really the archetypical robber baron of the time. And that was his job, that was his gig, was to be the front man for these capitalists. And so if you look at someone like Elon Musk now or whatever, there's a very straight line between him and some of the other capitalists and Leland Stanford, this guy who started this whole project.
And not only Musk, but there's this pattern where there is just a dumb guy who is useful. So Leland Stanford, Ronald Reagan, Steve Jobs in some sense.
Definitely.
So why do you think, what is it that creates these kind of useful individuals over and over again who end up embodying so much power or sort of exist as important fulcrum points in the system? Why does that happen over and over again?
Yeah, so you have, the reason that someone like Leland Stanford is such a great 19th century character is because these impersonal systems are really rising to dominate all human interaction and metabolism around the world, right? And so and the railroad is another great symbol for it, right? Because it comes running through town, and it's really loud, and it tears up the landscape, and it's representative of these forces of modernity, these capitalist forces. And I talk about the gold in the mid-19th century in California calling out to settlement, right? Calling out to these Anglo-American settlers. And I'm not really talking, it's not like the Lord of the Rings or whatever, gold isn't magical, but in this profit system that is now controlling the metabolism of all people throughout the world, those impersonal forces will lure people to that gold, right? Those impersonal forces will lure people to that land, to that water, to turn it into money as fast as they can, as big as they can, until there's somewhere better to do it somewhere else. And those forces of capitalist relations really hit California, Alta California, like a meteor, because the colonization to that point is so thin by Spain and by Mexico, just really thinly controlled territory. It's the last corner of the world as far as capitalist society is concerned, and it goes from being this last corner to really the center of this new system in the 20th and 21st centuries. So it's this reversal where the last becomes first, and California goes from being the end of the world, the brink of the world, to its real center.
One more question about Stanford before we go to somebody else. I'm going to try to wrap, again, 5 different threads into one question. It's really hard.
Yes.
But so Leland Stanford is really into horses.
Yes.
Why does that matter, and what does that have to do with the development of Stanford University as an institution?
So if you go to Stanford, they still call it the farm, which is kind of creepy. Yes, some people nodding. Some people know Stanford, and they still call it the farm. They don't really ask like what it's a farm of, but it started out as a horse farm, a stock farm for raising trotting horses in particular. And horses at the close of the 19th century are the most important technology in the country, basically, for agriculture, for transportation, for the military. Like, horses are the engines of the country because engines haven't been invented yet or generalized yet. And Leland Stanford has this idea that he's going to, it's very Silicon Valley like tech idea, I'm gonna improve horses. I'm gonna if I can make every horse in America worth an extra $100, we've got 13 million horses, that's $1.3 billion, which is, I think, $30 billion in today's money. Like, that's my business plan. And so he starts the biggest horse training farm in the world. He invests all this capital, gets the biggest staff of horse trainers in the world, including this guy, Charles Marvin, who runs the thing. But his problem is he wants to shorten the production cycle for these horses, because horses up to that point, in order for their genetic material, so to speak, to be valuable, they have to show not only that these horses are fast, but that their children are fast. And they generally didn't race horses to their full speed until they were a few years old. And so you're talking about really like 8 years before you can find out if a horse is valuable or not. And Leland Stanford, who's a real capitalist and coming into the world as a capitalist, says, millennia-old technology, carriage horses, old as anything, any human technology, whatever, I'm going to do it better. We're going to figure it out. We're going to make this in a different way. And he draws inspiration from the early childhood education movement in Germany, which is just inventing these things called kindergartens. And there's no kindergarten for children in the West yet, but he builds the first kindergarten in the West as a kindergarten for horses. And so he builds a shrunken down track, and he says he and Charles Marvin are going to run these horses as fast as they can, as young as they can. And they're going to produce the fastest, youngest horses in the history of the world, which then shorten the production cycle and allow them to sell it faster. And they, in fact, are able to accomplish this. And they call it the Palo Alto system, named for the place where they're raising these horses. And the world, the horse world is forced to admit that, like, wow, they really did it. They're spoiling a lot of material. They're wasting a lot of horses because a lot of these horses are not ready to run that fast. And so you snap a ligament and you're killing, promising horses, but you can't argue with the results. And these horses are quickly displaced by engines as, motors throughout the economy. But the horse farm in itself is replaced by Leland Stanford Jr. University after the death of Leland Stanford Jr., and the horses are sold off to pay for the school. But this logic continues to underlie the next 150 years of this place, right? And if you go to Silicon Valley now and you ask people about, like, what's the Palo Alto system, they won't know. They might lie and say that they know, because, like, people in Palo Alto don't like saying that they don't know things. But they won't know this, like, history. But then if you tell them, like, oh, it's about scaling, it's about heavy investment in technological research, it's about potential and optimizing for potential and growth and scale, they were like, oh yeah, Palo Alto, that's what we do here, Palo Alto system. Disruption, doing things a whole new way through technology and profit, like Palo Alto system. And I think it explains a lot, right? And it's interesting how these ideas can keep flowing through a place even as the personnel who enact them are unaware of their actual history.
Okay, one more question in this vein, then we'll go to the next person. This is what makes it so hard. So, from the farm, as a literal horse farm to Stanford University as an institution, one thing that you sort of suggest binds those two things together is the concept of just eugenics, right? Mm-hmm. That Stanford University is, in many senses, a eugenicist institution. As Harvard actual eugenicist, you talk about William Shockley a lot. Maybe that's the person we should talk about next, is before the person I was thinking about. But so who is William Shockley, and what makes that kind of out-and-out eugenics kind of so palatable to that world as applied to human beings rather than just horses and breeding good race horses.
Yeah, because I do want to bring in David Starr Jordan before we get to
Right.
Shockley, because he's the first president of the university, and he is a eugenicist. He's like the eugenicist. If you go to like the World Eugenicist conferences, he's like there. You know, this is a guy who's so like racist and involved with the progression of the white race that he's a strong anti-imperialist, because he doesn't want the Philippines, because like then you're stuck with those people, right? And he doesn't want war. He's a peace activist, because in modern war, he says the hero can be shot down by the clown, right? We're gonna waste our genes in a war, like, you know, and some little grunt can just pick up a gun and shoot our most noble soldier. So we need to make sure wars don't happen. So and he may or may not have killed Jane Lathrop Stanford, who is the founder's wife, and he gets to set the orientation for the school really uncontested. And he's very involved and invested in this eugenics question, both as a field of study and as a project for Stanford University itself. And he brings in a bunch of professors from Indiana University, including Louis Terman, who reinvents the IQ test as the Stanford Binet IQ test now. So Stanford becomes the home of human eugenics and what they called bionomics at this time. And one of the children of Palo Alto at this time is this kid named Bill Shockley Jr., whose dad is a professor of mining engineering at Stanford. His mom was a student of mining engineering at Stanford. Mining engineering is very important to is like the first tech subject of Stanford is mining engineering. And so Shockley's a product of this milieu, and he goes on to, most famously, win the Nobel Prize for inventing the point contact transistor, and is commonly held responsible for starting Silicon Valley with Shockley Semiconductor, which becomes Fairchild Semiconductor, which becomes all of the semiconductor firms, basically. But he's also most famous for, and if you talk to people who were alive for a significant part of the 20th century, about Bill Shockley and who Bill Shockley was, it's that he's a racist. He's a very, very, very prominent racist. Even though his training is as a physicist, he was, like Stanford professors before him, very invested in questions of genetics and put himself forward as an expert in questions of genetics and specifically eugenics. And he turned Palo Alto into a bastion continued Palo Alto's history as a bastion of eugenic thought. But he's really embedded in this history, and when you talk to people who are Gen X or above, basically, about William Shockley, they're like, oh my God, that's one of the most important racists of the 20th century. And yet he's also fully acknowledged, commonly acknowledged as really the grandfather of Silicon Valley. He's the guy who puts the silicon in Silicon Valley. So these histories are really intertwined.
Okay, the other main character I've been thinking about is Herbert Hoover.
Get away from Hoover.
To the extent that Americans think about Herbert Hoover at all, it's as the guy who lost to FDR because he didn't manage the Depression, and then is sort of relegated in our history books to the footnotes. He's not considered a major figure, I think, by most Americans, if they even have heard of him. You come away from this book understanding Herbert Hoover as one of the pivotal figures of the entire 20th century. For a lot of reasons. Why is that? If you could just give a glimpse of all that he did.
Yeah, well, it's partly because he lives for a very long time. He outlives FDR, and it's important. So we do think of his story as ending in 1932, and up till then, he's got this very epic American story. So he's part of the first class of Stanford University. He's an orphan from the West. His dad's a shopkeeper who, dies of disease very quickly, and his mom dies of disease very quickly, and he's sent off to Quaker relatives in the West. And he applies for this new school that they're starting up in California, where they're going to teach mining engineering, and he becomes a student of mining engineering. And it's sort of a golden boy of the first class of Stanford University. And it's not because he's so academically good, it's that he's like a cool guy. He's the sports team manager, and he's really trustworthy, and he's like confident, and seems like he's a man of the 20th century. And so Stanford as a university really backs him and sets him up to be this outstanding mining engineer, which he then goes and does. And he has this sort of Forrest Gump-like existence as a young man touring the world. He's in Peru, he's in South Africa, he's in Western Australia, he's in Myanmar, he's in China, he's in Russia, and like all ways to going around exploiting all these, he's helping, you know, the colonial turn at the end of the 20th century, or the end of the 19th century, where there's the scramble for resources by European powers all over the world. And America wasn't a huge player in that, except in California. But they did use a lot of Californian personnel. And so California mining engineers were prized even among European mining firms. And Herbert Hoover, among those, was seen as this really like the college boy, you know? He's like, not like these old, it's sort of like Leland Stanford, right? He's gonna do it the new way, with the very capitalist way. And that, he takes tools that he learned at Stanford and brings them all around the world, including South Africa. And so when South Africa's got labor troubles in the mines, he says, I know how to deal with this. You bring in workers from China and you bring in workers from Italy and you put them in 2 different categories and you increase everyone's work level and you decrease everyone's wages. And that's what he does. You know, he's in his early 20s and he runs around the world doing this kind of stuff. But he's also running into conflicts. So he's like at the Boxer Rebellion in China, like Herbert Hoover is caught in the battle of the Boxer Rebellion in China. He narrowly avoids the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia at a copper mine where he's been a copper, you know, he's leading this copper mine with a minor Romanov prince or whatever. And then that guy gets like exiled he ends up as a security guard at a dog racetrack in Shanghai. They're like Romanov prince. Well, look out there. Someone doesn't want you to know about her. And he becomes Secretary of Commerce. He becomes this like major global figure as a young man, such that by the time he comes back to the United States in the 20s, he's like, I'll be president. Either party could nominate me. I'll take whichever party wants to nominate me. I'll be president. And that was his attitude. And they asked him, what party are you in? And he says, I'm a liberal. I'm a classical liberal. Which is funny because that's been a conservative response ever since then. And he's really the foundation for what I see as modern conservatism. And he experiences all the upheavals of this period as very personal. So there's not just these mines where that he owns shares in are getting seized all around the world, but he's got a farm in California that is a communist uprising happens at his farm, the Hoover farm. The Bonus Army, which is maybe a story you know, comes marching on the White House, and he's convinced that this is a Bolshevik uprising come to kill him and take the White House. And so he develops this real antipathy towards global communism and the communist movement and becomes sort of its foil and experiences 32 as this huge betrayal because the capitalist class really ends up backing Roosevelt. And so these are his buddies, and he's just devastated. But in the period following the war, when Roosevelt's dead, so Roosevelt dies and Truman is yet to be elected president. This is a period where Hoover is the last elected president, and he's still alive. He's not just still alive, but he's very active in the 40s, right? He was a young guy. And so Truman calls him in, and he's the one who sells the Marshall Plan to congressional Republicans. And then he is the one who ends up in Europe, you know, doing the reconstruction of Germany. He's got his guys that he always hangs out with, the guys that he's brought along through his whole career around the world. They're put in charge of the U.S. presence in the Philippines and the U.S. presence in Japan and former Japanese territories and Germany. And he's really the one who's remaking this post-war era. And he loses a couple presidential elections. His guys lose, and he doesn't like Eisenhower, doesn't like Nixon very much, and he never gets to be the peak of power again. But if you look back now, and especially if you consider the Hoover Institution at Stanford, which really backed Reagan, which really backed George W. Bush, which birthed the contemporary conservative movement, it really all goes back to Hoover. And I'm not sure that if you ask the like Silicon Valley conservatives, like, is Herbert Hoover a personal hero to you? Like, is he the model for your politics? Are you a Hooverite? They would probably say no, or like they probably don't know that much about Herbert Hoover. I feel like I didn't know much about Herbert Hoover. But then if you look at his politics and how he thought the world should go, and then you look at how these tech guys are actually practicing, it's the exact same. And so like the Peter Thiel meeting with Trump, where he's got all the tech executives, you know, Bezos and Sheryl Sandberg, all in a room with the president, that's exactly how Hoover ran things, right? There he has so many examples of him with just like corporate leaders hacking out policy, being like, I got you guys, whatever you need, we're gonna make it happen. This is how we get things done. And it's really continued till now.
I forget if there's a specific phrase for it, but you talk a lot about the idea of an associative economy where all these big private players come together and they sort of work things out without government intervention or government playing that role.
Yeah,
Is that
government
sort of
support.
one of the lasting legacies of Hoover?
Yeah, well, it's Hawley, who's the historian, who calls it the associative state, is the famous description of how Hoover ran things. And really, like, if you think of, they created the model zoning law, so like people are realizing increasingly that like zoning policy is a huge problem in the history of America. And that was established by the Hoover administration, where they got together a bunch of real estate people and said, okay, how should we do this? And how should we establish the legal rationale? And it's not that they didn't have government support, it's that the government only wanted to support, right? They didn't want it to, and Hoover had this idea basically that if a government was to regulate business, that is to impinge on the speculative value of their business, which is equivalent to theft, right? So if I say, I'm gonna regulate your business, you're like, well, that makes my business less valuable, which means you're stealing from me. You're basically stealing from me. So all the government can do, if they don't want to steal from capital, is find ways to support them. And this goes back to the history of California and how California capital established itself under this associative model. It's something he learned at Stanford. And not for nothing, Leland Stanford and his three buddies, Crocker, Hopkins, and Huntington, were called the Associates, right? That was their group name was the Associates. So he comes by this term honestly. But again, like, I don't know if these conservatives know that they're doing associative logic, that like that's their idea of the state, but that's definitely how they think things should be run, right? They believe in the government as long as the government is helping them do what they want.
So another structural economic phenomenon you talk about a lot, this word appears a lot, bifurcation, and it describes basically economic patterns that seem visible really from the days of the gold rush, back in 49ers, all the way up into the Silicon Valley startups of today. Can you explain what bifurcation is and why it's so important as a concept?
Yeah, it's a splitting in half, right, is in the strictest sense, to bifurcate, right, to split in two sides. And that this is used as a tool and as a phenomenon within capitalist society. It's naturally occurring, but also consciously. So when I talked about Hoover earlier in South Africa saying like, all right, we got to handle this this labor problem, what are we gonna do? We're gonna split them in half, right? We gotta split these workers in different parts, and then that will solve our problem. And the one becomes two is the Maoist line. And this is a strategy that capital is using once it hits limits. And the story, I think, the story of the whole book is really how capital deals with things it can no longer deal with, right? Situations that it can no longer handle. How does it handle those situations? What does it do when it runs into limits? And bifurcation is really one of those solutions. And so if you think of Prop 19, which in California carved out, or Prop 13 rather, protected homeowners in California from increases in property taxes for as long as they own their homes, bifurcated the working class into homeowners and workers that didn't own their homes and separated their interests from each other in order to solve this problem that capital was having of an insurgent working class. And we've seen it constantly, more and more bifurcation. You can constantly bifurcate groups on race, you can bifurcate groups on gender, and we can bifurcate groups on labor relations, right? So when we see gig workers being split off into a different labor relationship. And so this is a contrary tendency to maybe the working class tendency of massification, right? You want to bring everybody together, and capital wants to constantly split the working class such that it might continue to survive.
So beyond Stanford University and all the big tech companies and people like Hoover and people like Stanford, you also spend a lot of time in this book talking about the radical history of the region. Obviously people know a lot about, or at least have heard a lot about, the Black Panthers. But you also talked about the Bay Area becoming this hub for a lot of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist activists from around the world, actually. Can you talk about like why that ended up happening and what kind of impact the region had on those struggles?
Yeah, it's very curious because I didn't really know this history, and it wasn't because I figured the radical history of California, at least the way I've read it, starts in the 20th century, beginning of 20th century, maybe with the IWW, maybe you get the early Communist Party, but I didn't have this sense of the anti-colonial movement, especially in Palo Alto. And that was what was so surprising, is that Palo Alto itself becomes a hub for the anti-colonial movement. And that really is a strange outcome of David Starr Jordan's sort of odd politics at this moment, where he's anti-England. He's anti-imperialist because he thinks imperialism drags down proud Anglo-Saxon countries. And so he thinks that the British occupation of India, for example, drags down both India and England, and that he opposes it. And so that makes Palo Alto, of all places, which is sort of at that point David Starr Jordan's fiefdom, into a relatively safe place for anti-British, anti-colonial radicals. And so you saw, especially from India, but not also from Japan and China and across the Pacific Rim, people fleeing persecution in their country and coming to California to sort of hide out. Because again, California is sort of the edge of the world. And so there are like radical Korean students who are opposing Japanese colonialism in Korea. There's the Chinese nationalist movement. So Sun Yat-sen, famous Chinese anti-colonial leader, his son is at Berkeley studying and is part of this movement. And David Starr Jordan, in fact, recruits this guy, Lala Hardayal, who is a Indian anti-colonial thinker, leader, who's part of the First International, really, and like in communication with Bakunin and all sorts of anarchist radicals. And he applies to teach at Stanford, to come out to California. And David Starr Jordan sees his resume and he's like, wow, you studied Sanskrit at Oxford? Like, that's so cool. Like, we don't have anyone who studied at Oxford here. You know, this is a really like rural school at that point. And so he brings the guy, you're going to study, you're going to teach Indian philosophy? Oh, that's awesome. Like Indian philosophy, sounds cool. Doesn't realize he means like Marx, right? And so he shows up and he's like, I've combined this idea of Buddhism and anarchism and Karl Marx. And they're like, and bombs. And they're like, oh man, shit. And he starts the like Palo Alto radical communist anarchist revolutionary club or whatever, and starts holding meetings in his shack in Palo Alto. And David Starr Jordan's like, fuck, you know, I really screwed this one up. Like, these are not the people, this is not the Indian philosophy I was thinking about. And he's not the only one. Like M.N. Roy, who ends up co-founding the Mexican Communist Party, comes through at Stanford, and he, I think seduces is maybe the wrong word, but falls in love with a Stanford student from Utah named Evelyn Trent, who becomes Evelyn Roy, and joins him at his side in the world communist movement. And they're like they become major players in the world communist movement, running around the world, founding communist parties and like hanging out in Moscow with Lenin and stuff. And the US government threatens to take away her citizenship because she married a man, because at that point people from Asia are ineligible for US citizenship. And not only are they ineligible for citizenship, but anyone who marries someone ineligible for citizenship is threatened with the revocation of their citizenship. So this is a girl from Utah, studies at Stanford, and is told, like, you will lose your American citizenship for your participation in these politics that you picked up at Stanford University. And you'll be expelled from this country permanently. And she comes back and sort of like renounces her politics and comes home and sort of says, sorry, I want to stay an American. But these were the currents that were like picking people up through Stanford from the very beginning of the first international, right? And Har Dayal ends up leading thousands of Indian farm workers from California and the Northwest back to India as part of a revolutionary attack on the British control. There was a bomb attack, and he's like, all right, it's time to go. And he gathers up pretty much, I don't want to say all, but the majority at that point of farm workers from India who are in the west coast of North America, gets them on boats with guns to go back to India to fight the colonists, and they lose. And something similar happens in Korea, and something similar happens in Japan. These are not successful moments in the history of the anti-colonial movement. That won't come till a little bit later. But it's crazy that from the beginning, California and Palo Alto is part of this, and it's part of what made me better understand California as part of this anti-colonial tradition, and then part of the colonial tradition, right? To see California as a 19th century overseas colony, which is what it is to the United States, in the same way that Algeria is to France, right? Like, Algeria is much closer to Paris than California is to Washington, D.C.
I think two more questions before I'm going to send it over to the audience. So the personal computing revolution in the late 70s, early 80s, I think every American has sort of internalized a version of what happened. So you have these guys, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, some other guys who just sort of were tinkering around their garages, and through sheer intelligence and drive and grit, they launched this kind of technological wave that changed the world, just sort of as a function of who they were as individual people. That, I think, is the story that most Americans have. I think that's the story that most Silicon Valley founders tell themselves. What is the actual story, as simply as you can render it, you know, of why we have the personal computer boom happening in this kind of period in the late 70s and 80s, sort of all at once, seemingly?
Yeah, well, I think you got to go back to the 60s, which is where Microsoft gets started at this high school in Seattle called Lakeside. And I knew that, and I knew that the personal computer represented the privatization of computer technology, that it goes from these public institutions, the big science era, publicly in computer centers that are in universities for the most part, into the private era, the personal computer, where it's inside corporations, inside homes. And I understood that, but I didn't really didn't think about what it meant to be in a private school at that point in the 60s, and what people who were going to kids who were going to private school in cities in the 60s, what that meant historically, politically. And so I talk about Seattle a little bit, and I put the beginning of Microsoft with the Lakehurst Programmers Club, which was Paul Allen and Bill Gates, the founders of Microsoft, as teenagers. What does it mean for Paul Allen to transfer in from his public school in Seattle to this private school in the late 60s? Well, there's the reaction to integration that's going on through the country. Transferring your white kid into a private school in the 60s, in the late 60s, as a reaction to the threat of integration, is a very specific historical political moment. And so I look at in the book that this is going on, these teenagers are forming the future of private computing at the same time that other teenagers in their same city are forming one of the first Black Panther chapters outside of California in Seattle. And I talk about Stokely Carmichael as giving a speech to 4,000 people at one of the de facto segregated Seattle schools saying, we have the worst schools in the country. We're not going to Vietnam. If you want us to kill, we'll kill right here. And he's talking about schools. He's talking about Seattle schools. He's talking about the segregation of Seattle schools. And that this is where the personal computer comes from. It comes from that struggle, right? It's in the same way that Palo Alto is the suburb that moved to escape. The personal computer is the same thing, right? It's a move to escape these tensions over the public sphere, both the integration of schools and the struggles over computer centers, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, but student radicals were bombing computer centers all over the country. And so they had to find ways to secure computers, and one of the ways to do that was to privatize them. And I talk about early Apple And what made early Apple so exciting as a company, it wasn't that they had the smartest guys. Steve Wozniak was pretty smart, but they didn't have the smart, Xerox had the smartest guys. And so the question of why does Xerox, this huge company with all this money, all the, the best researchers, why do they come to Apple in an exchange that ends up really benefiting Apple to the detriment of Xerox? What did they want from Apple? And the answer is manufacturing, is that Xerox was stuck with all this manufacturing overhead and these union agreements and a whole mid-century labor relation. And Apple was making its computers in Bay Area basements and kitchens where a predominantly Filipino workforce was doing it off the books for piece rates. And that's who was wiring those computers, and that's what Xerox wanted. That's what made Apple so exciting. That's what made Apple so good. It wasn't Steve Jobs. It wasn't Steve Wozniak. It was these women, housewives throughout the Bay Area, immigrant housewives, who were wiring these boards all day, in unventilated kitchens with toxic fumes. And so when you put these, the story of the personal computer into the global story of what was going on at the time, it looks very different and much less a product of individual people's intellectual heft, let's say.
Okay, last question. I think it's hard even for informed people to figure out what's going on in Silicon Valley right now. It's hard to understand what's propping the place up. It feels like a while since there's been a big hit, although people are kind of expecting AI to be the next thing. But beyond that, the story of Theranos, still looms large over a lot of people's heads. Juicero, all of these kinds of companies that didn't pan out the way that people hoped. Even apps that people know about, like Uber, it's not clear how they're turning a profit, whether they can turn a profit. But something is keeping the whole thing churning. And one of the stories that I sort of helped me understand in your book why that is actually a story from way back. You talk about this military tech project called SAGE, which seemed to me like an early example of, well, there's not really a thing here, but there's a lot of money going into it, and it's sort of propping everything up. So can you talk about SAGE and what it says about the Silicon Valley economy and whether or not it might point to where the Silicon Valley economy is going today?
Yeah, so SAGE was the first computer network in the United States. And what it was, it's funny because earlier in the year, last year, Elon Musk was complaining about the plane tracker, the Elon Musk jet tracker, and said, this is wrong. This isn't what this should be used for. Plane tracking was actually the first thing that they used a computer network for because it was supposed to check for missiles. And so what they would do is it was connected to a radar system, and at the beginning of the day, they'd load in these punch cards that were supposed to represent the airplane flight plans for the day. And so the computer would know where planes were supposed to be, and then it would run radar and compare the radar results to the flight plans that it had. And if it ran into something that wasn't supposed to be there, that wasn't on the flight plan, then the concept was that this was a Soviet bomber with a nuclear weapon that was coming that you could respond to automatically. And then you could arm your missiles and try to take down this plane. It never worked, not just because the Soviets never actually sent a bomber, but by the time it was installed and the time it was created, they already had missiles which go up over the flight plans, and so it wasn't gonna do anything. It was never going to work. Also, they had radar jamming, and so they could have just jammed the radar. And so from the beginning, it was just a air flight traffic computer. But it was a really, really great project for IBM and all the subcontractors, and they produced this propaganda video about how great the whole system was. And if you think about mid-century computing, you still picture SAGE. I don't know if you saw pictures of it or whatever, but if you think of white guys with the thick glasses and the white button-down shirts sitting at a display with a circle display doing a radar type thing, with a light pen pointing at it or whatever, that was SAGE. And again, it was a real boondoggle, not run totally out of Palo Alto. IBM is not a Palo Alto company or whatever, but it set the stage for all of these future projects, and people point to it as like, oh, this is a good story about how the military accidentally funds all this civilian stuff. And it's an example, I think, of, yeah, like computer puffery or whatever. But I do think it's important not to lose sight of what Palo Alto's role during this period was. And when I originally started this project, and I think when most people think about the signature product of Silicon Valley in the 20th century, they imagine the personal computer, maybe the silicon chip, right? But they don't think, maybe the internet. But when I got done with this project, I really came to the understanding that it was the nuclear missile. That's where the first generation of silicon chips all go into the Minuteman I nuclear missile. A lot of the testing instruments and a lot of the materials science that was going for these missiles. This was the ultimate project of Palo Alto. And if you look at the composition by value of one of these missiles, right, they're big and made of metal, and so you think the big made of metal part would be the expensive part, but it's the electronics that are really the expensive part. And none of those nuclear missiles got launched, right? So you could say like, oh, on one hand, it's another boondoggle. It's like Star Wars, you know, like never really existed. As far as we know, like nuclear missiles don't even work. But they did serve a real purpose, right? The real purpose of that nuclear missile was to win the Cold War. It was a gun put to the world's head that said, if anything happens to America, everyone dies. And that's what Palo Alto was for, was to load that gun and put it to the world's head. And that worked. And America won the Cold War, and we have a world that remains unequal in many of the same ways that it was 100 years ago. And that was an outside shot, right? Like 100 years ago, if you said like, if you asked rich people in rich and powerful countries, are you gonna be able to maintain your hold for another century on the world? They would have said no way, right? Like the ideas of liberalism are already out of the bag, right? Like people can come up, they know that all people are equal. Anti-colonialism's on the march. Like there's no way we're gonna be able to hold the world off. But they had Palo Alto, and they had the nuclear missile, and they had computers, which then end up being used to, you know, catalog future murder victims in Latin America during the Cold War, right? These are tools for a purpose. It's not the purpose that they sell us on. It's not the purpose of universal human progress, but it is a purpose. They're definitely for something. Palo Alto's for something. And so when you think of what's undergirding this, right? What is keeping this alive? It's Palo Alto that's keeping the system alive, right? It's Palo Alto's, they're not just scammers, right? They're taking money from Saudi Arabia that's pulled out of the ground there and putting it somewhere for them safe, right? And you see this in the 70s and 80s where you see all sorts of dictatorships pulling money out of their country and putting it into Silicon Valley. Imelda Marcos buys 3 tech companies in Silicon Valley, right? And so Silicon Valley and Palo Alto is an important project. It has something to do. It's just not the thing they tell people about.
Cool. So yeah, I don't know how we want to do questions, but does anyone have any?
I'll come around with the mic. Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. They say the past is never dead. It's not even the past.
It's not even the past.
So this, so this idea of progressive racists, and they weren't just in Palo Alto. Farther east, you had Jack London, who was a socialist, and he was a racist.
Absolutely.
And this bouncing around today, where we have, I'm old enough to remember when the liberals and progressives were anti-war, and now they're military-industrial complex as best friend. And so this happens all the time, it seems. And the other question is, so we all know about the platforms and that they're moving us in the wrong direction, and we don't want to go. So where would be the alternative, the counter ecosystem? Let's say another ecosystem is possible. Where, Baltimore here, we can start here maybe?
Yeah, so you definitely still see the eugenic logic. Again, like the same people, the same institutions are still putting forward this eugenic logic if you ask. And I think even since I wrote this book, it's become much more prevalent and common to hear from Silicon Valley people in particular this eugenic style talk about that really echoes the same, again, like they don't know that they're just spouting the same stuff from the place where they live from 100 years ago, but they really, really, really are. And like, if you think of like evolutionary psychology as sort of a deeply held set of beliefs by this group of people, like bionomics, which was the same thing 100 years ago, like comes from Stanford. So you're totally right that you see the same cycle. As far as where do we start with a different world? I look at that in Palo Alto in the same place, and I say that the Muwekma Ohlone tribe have a ancestral claim to the Stanford lands that Stanford recognizes. And this is a politically constituted group of people that's going to be lobbying in DC in a few weeks for their federal recognition. It's not just like the indigenous people or whatever. There's 500 people in a tribe that need a place to live on their ancestral land. And I think it's very low-hanging fruit in terms of reform or leadership for thinking about another way forward for the coming centuries for Stanford and the Board of Trustees to turn over at least some of that land and at least some of their endowment to begin a project like that of land return in North America. And I think they're in a great place to do that. They're in an exceptional place to do that. And if they can't do that, if they can't manage that, then that tells us something just as important, I think.
Who else has a question?
I thought I heard you say, and I'm not totally certain, so this could be a totally null question, but I thought I heard you sort of toss off this idea of the Bay Area, or Palo Alto specifically, Northern California, as standing in a position of being a colony of the United States in the way that Algeria is for France, say. And I mean, you know, there's geographic distance, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about sort of the political economy of that, or or cultural economy of that, what you see as that force.
So when I was looking at the 19th century, first of all, it becomes clear that it's literally an overseas colony, right? That until you get the transcontinental railroad, the fastest way to go from the United States to California, even once it becomes a state, right? Even once it becomes Anglo-American territory, is you go down through the Gulf of Mexico, you go across Honduras, and go up the other side in a boat, right? That's very far and hard to get to. And so the capitalist class that develops in California, I think, shares similarities with colonial capitalist classes in other places, which is that they're insulated a little bit from their other capitalists, which gives them a measure of free movement that they don't necessarily have back home. And so they can install, for example, different labor relations in the colony or in the hinterland than you can in the metropole. And so Indian slavery, for example, in California persists past the Civil War, for example. And it's underregulated and underobserved by the East, but still is allowed to persist by California capitalists because they have this sort of freedom. And you see this continue into the 20s and 30s, where the California capitalist class has a measure of liberty and control that capitalists elsewhere in the country don't have, and that they control, say, the California Highway Patrol, for example, is controlled directly by the growers, the agricultural growers, and are employed as a sort of fascist militia by the growers, and financed directly by the growers, right? They're paying their salaries in a way that would not have been acceptable on the East Coast, where you've got a stronger labor movement and a bigger division of power. And so once I started seeing seeing California as a colony, it started to make more sense about how they're able to maintain a different kind of labor relation and different kind of society that becomes very important to the country later when they're moving production in the 60s and 70s. And you see the shift of manufacturing towards California for precisely these reasons, that it has less of a unionized workforce and has lower wages, more of an immigrant workforce. But then also you see an anti-colonial movement in California, and you look at the 60s and you say, why is there an anti-colonial uprising in California? Why are anti-colonial militants throughout the world looking at the Panthers in California? Why are they calling California the belly of the beast in Angola, right? Why are they paying attention to what's happening in California, in South Africa? Like, why is this a centerpiece of the world? And it's because I think that California is somewhere different, right? It's a different country in a way than the rest of the United States was. And so I think seeing it that way allowed me to make a number of connections that I don't, as well as seeing it as closer to the Pacific Rim and the Philippines and Taiwan and Japan end up playing at least as important a role in California history as the East Coast does and as East Coast Capital does. So yeah, the more you look at it that way, the more things start to make sense and the more California starts to make sense, I think.
And over there.
Just directly following up on that, I wonder about the particular place of Mexico in these stories. As an East Coaster going to California, an East Coaster who studies Mexico and has done a lot of work in Mexico, I'm always very struck when I'm in California about how much California is just Mexico. And so I wonder about the extent to which Mexico plays a particular role in your story and the kind of contradictory places that it shows up.
Yeah, it plays a huge role, and Mexican people play a huge role, obviously, in the history of California and Chicano people. And it's tricky even to talk about the language that you use, because there's this moment in the 19th century where suddenly people become Mexican in Alta California, and it was a Mexican-controlled territory technically, but the racial mapping and the national mapping onto the border is something very particular that happens at a time during this history. It's not like external to it. And it plays an interesting role because it changes. And so one of the people I talk about a lot is Ernesto Galarza, who's a Mexican-American labor organizer, Chicano-American labor organizer, we can say, whose main thing is cross-border organizing, and he represents this history and tendency of attempts to organize Chicano workers across the border and reduce the role of the border in their lives. And he's a Stanford guy. He comes out of the Bay Area, grows up in the Bay Area, and he's got a memoir called Barrio Boy about his sort of experience of the progressive age and becoming like a beneficiary of US multiculturalism in the Roosevelt era, and then watching the betrayal of not just Mexico and Chicanos in the post-war time, but Latin America in general, and watching the promises of the Roosevelt administration be basically instantly betrayed during World War II. And he's someone who can never sort of get in line with that, and this causes him a lot of trouble in his life, and so he ends up standing behind this labor organizing. He leaves academia and goes into labor organizing, trying to organize farm workers across the border, and is ultimately pretty unsuccessful and has a very hard time, but it leads directly into Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, who I actually talk about a lot less in this book, I think, than other histories, partially because I wanted to talk about that cross-border history and California in this global context and sort of reduce the idea of the border. And the United Farm Workers history of the border is a little different than the Galarza one, and this is the one that I wanted to link up. So yeah, Mexico plays a huge role. Mexican Americans play a huge role. Chicano Californians play a huge role, but maybe not the one that people are used to reading about in terms of California history, I think, in the book. Do we have time for one more, maybe?
Yeah, we have time for a couple more. So I actually wanted to ask a question. See if I can avoid feedback. There's a lot of detailed history in the book. There's a lot of really great stories. There's a lot of really great stories of communist projects of resistance, projects of revolt, anti-colonial struggle. There's also like a broader theoretical armature, right? And it's one of the things that that awful New York Times review gets really wrong, right? Which is like, you say something like, capital has to dominate labor, right? Or else it ceases to exist. And the idiot reviewer is like, oh, they're just saying this because they don't like capital, right? And they're missing the point that that's the definition of the structure you're talking about, right? So I guess, long way of saying, I'm curious about the sort of like theoretical mixtape that kind of informs the book. Like the vision of capitalism as a global system that nevertheless has, spatial realization in very specific ways, the way in which people come to embody as meat puppets, the larger dynamics of the system, and then just the emphasis on, on exploitation as a fundamental category of the way this whole thing is put together, like at a structural level. What was kind of in the background as you were writing this?
Yeah, well, part of the fun part about writing about this history is that so much of the theorization and theories that I was working with were produced by people who were part of this history, who were involved as struggling characters in this history. So Paul Baran, who's someone I write about a lot in the book, as one of the co-authors of this book, Monopoly Capital, as well as other books, who's one of the main theoretical influences for the text. Cedric Robinson's in there, both as a character and as a theorist. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, both as a character, many times as a character, like more times than I expected as a character. Like Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz is a best-selling radical historian. I did not know that she was a worker at the Fairchild silicon chip plant who organized people there, right? It's like, I didn't know that, but totally true. May Nye is another one who's a very important historian, who's a California historian whose work is in here. I mean, Mike Davis, obviously. And all of these people are producing these theories through their encounters with this history, not just of this time, but of California in particular and the particularities of California capitalism. And so one of the projects of this book was to pull out a California communist theoretical tradition as well as the historical narrative from people like Shosui Kotoku, who's in the early 20th century writing about imperialism as a Japanese refugee, political refugee in California, all the way through Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who's writing about the California prison system and post-Keynesian economics in California. And it becomes interesting how much of the American communist tradition, American theoretical, left-wing theoretical tradition that we're working with now comes specifically out of California, without even getting into the Frankfurt School in LA or Perry Anderson, or I don't even get into SoCal for the most part. Even just how much of it is coming out of the Bay Area was surprising to me, and suggests, I think, that we need more investigation of these tendencies. So maybe I'll get to do more of that in the future. But you really can take this tradition back to Marx, which is where I begin the book, is Marx trying to find out about California, writing a letter saying, can you give me a really big book about, which is kind of a joke about this book, right? He says, can you give me something meaty about economic conditions in California? It seems really important. And of course, this is the mid-19th century, and no one has any big books about the economic conditions in California because it's happening right there. But already from the beginning of these ideas and from this historical period, California is important from the First International, right? They're coextensive histories, and I think seeing them that way allows us to see California in a new light. So if people read the book and can see that, then I think that's a success.
Do one or two more. I got one, two. Oh, I got a bunch more. Let's do
Now
it.
we got a bunch of questions.
Thanks so much for this work and this presentation. Oh, I'm sorry. Tell me if I should do something different.
They don't want to hear.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really infuriating about Silicon Valley is that it puts out its own writing about itself and like its own stories about itself. There's no shortage of histories of Silicon Valley. You got like Glenna Matthews, Annalise Saxenian, Christophe Lecuyer, people that are like in some cases paid by the industry to write these histories, or like they or their partners worked for these companies, right?
Yeah.
So the narratives that they're putting out are really, really different than the narrative that you just described, and I'm sure is beautifully laid out in the book. Can you talk about like what it's like to write in that kind of environment where it's so saturated by like perspectives from the right? How do you interact with like the information that's coming from these people, these histories? Like, do you engage them at all? You're just like, yeah, maybe some of you are thinking about that environment.
Yeah, I mean, some of those are better than others. Like Couillard is pretty good. Like, got some, in terms of the straight up history of some of the electronic stuff is good. Glenna Matthews has some useful stuff. What's funny is I find that the ones that are based on interviews, because so many of them are based on interviewing these important figures, right? That's like the great man history. You do it by sort of reporting and talking to these guys. These guys tell the same stories that are written in the books about them, right? And so if you're Charlie Spork or you're, one of these guys who has read 7 books about yourself and what you did in the 60s, like the legend of yourself. You probably hired someone to put that out there in the first place. And so you see these repeated. And so a book, I'm on the live stream. I'm going to get myself in trouble talking about other people's business histories of Silicon Valley. The Saxenian one, for example, is very, very popular, and it's a controlling history. It's about the comparative history of Route 128 in Boston and Silicon Valley, and why does Silicon Valley become Silicon Valley and Route 128 doesn't? And she has a particular theory, and this is a very popular academic book in business history, and so people just sort of replace the history of Silicon Valley with that book. Or they do the same thing with the Californian ideology story or the John Markoff book. That's 2 versions of the same history, which is the hippies invented the internet and that's good, or the hippies invented the internet and that's bad. 2 separate versions. I don't think either of them ends up being true. So there's a lot of this business history of Silicon Valley, and I've read a fair amount of it. I can tell those stories, right? Once you can read enough of it to know the stories. And it is really canonical field. And so like there are 10 books that you gotta read, and read those 10 books. I did, I read all of them, and then some. But there's also a lot of writing about Palo Alto in particular and Silicon Valley from other fields, that come out of the ethnic studies revolt in the 60s and 70s. And so there are some really, really good books from Black studies, from Native studies, from Asian American studies, from ethnic studies itself about Palo Alto from different angles. So there's a great like Chicano history of the area. There's a great Native history of the area. There are a couple good Black histories of the area. And so a lot of those histories really armed me with some of the social theory and even just narrative and anecdotes that the other ones probably don't have. So that was really helpful. There's a lot of digitized computer periodicals that are newly digitized, like computer news stuff from the 70s and 80s that I worked through a lot of, and I think you can find more interesting perspectives there than maybe the same stories repeated 10 times because they hadn't worked out what the precise narratives for everything that happened was. And so you find more like polyvocal accounts of certain happenings. But in some ways it made it easier because a lot of it's working with the same material over and over again, and it's not very sophisticated. And so like it's a pretty low bar, no offense to people who either do this history or whatever, but that's what I've found as people are now. I'm talking to like real California historians who scare the shit out of me because they've been doing this for decades, and they're like, wow, that was really good. Like it's not the same as writing about like church history in Boston or something where like you're gonna really have to clear some high bar. Silicon Valley history, the way it's written, is very business heavy, and a lot of it's wrong. Like the specific like things are wrong, and I did that when I was doing a like second round fact check, where you're fact checking the secondary sources that you're using, which is hard, and a lot of them are just wrong. Like so, Bill Gates's high school tuition was not $5,000 a semester; it was $1,600 a semester. And if you read like big biographies of Bill Gates, they'll repeat the 5,000 number, and it's just wrong. There's a famous one about the Neiman Marcus kitchen computer, is this early computer history thing, and it's in the history that they never sold any. Wrong, they sold a bunch. In fact, they sold too many, and they were really frustrated because they had to fulfill these 5 orders or whatever. And so, but these get repeated over and over and over and over again in every Silicon Valley history, and then you just refer to the last secondary source. And I was shocked writing this book how much of history is constructed in that way.
Some other hands?
Thanks. So my question kind of builds off of that, actually, in a little bit of a sense. So you talked about a lot of kind of countervailing forces, right? Juxtaposing Black Panthers and how you have, you know, particularly in schools, 2 different kinds of sort of parts of the same generation coming up, right, in this area. And I'm wondering, when you think about sort of the Silicon Valley of today, the players in capital, the Elon Musks, et cetera, do you see a analogous countervailing force rising up? Do you see any particular force in the area, or maybe not even in the area, but not, you know, relating to the area? And if so, you know, who is telling that countervailing narrative, right? If this generation of capital is still telling its own story in the business biography sort of way, but updated, is there a countervailing narrative, a countervailing force, and where do we learn about them?
Yeah, well, insofar as Silicon Valley is now everywhere, which I guess is a little easier, right? So certainly the whole production process is fraught. So Apple's whole production line is very vulnerable to political uprising right now. And you've seen that in electronics factories in mainland China are in a very tenuous place right now. And I talk a little bit about labor organizing and labor despair in Apple factories in China, but I think that's obviously an important place to look anywhere in the world when you're looking at labor struggle right now. But that it's also directly tied to Silicon Valley, right? It's not a world away. That's the people who are producing the electronics for Silicon Valley. At the same time, we've also seen a decade of unprecedented uprising in the United States, right? Like right here. And I think they did in 2020, in the summer of 2020, during the George Floyd uprising, they did barricade and batten down downtown Palo Alto, which I think is kind of funny. Yeah, they did do that. There were not riots in downtown Palo Alto. I guess there were a little bit when I was a kid during the invasion of Iraq, but that was a little different. I've got a talk next week with the Tech Workers Organizing Committee. Already they've had a very large number of RSVPs, so there are clearly some workers who are interested in this history of tech worker resistance. I wish we saw more of a student movement right now. It's kind of hard. I don't envy the position of students today and what they're facing and the number of challenges they face in terms of organizing. But we really are less than 3 years out from the largest uprising in American history, right? And it's hard. A lot of people want us to forget about that. And I'm very insistent on not. And this book was produced in the shadow of the uprising, as well as the struggles over land and water in North America and both American continents, all of America. And I think those are the edges of political practice now, right? And so when I talk about land back as where Palo Alto's political energies could go in the future, I think that's representative of the country and the world as a whole, right? I think that's, when I try to end optimistically in that way. Maybe some people don't read it that way. I try to end optimistically, looking forward to a post-American century, and that's the only way we get there, right?
So I'm going to take one more, and if you have other questions, you can get them answered when you buy a copy of the book and get it signed. So that's the incentive.
Hi, Malcolm. I really loved your book.
Thank you.
Very masterful, as I think Osita said. Could you talk a little bit more about drugs, both LSD which was used in a number of ways in Silicon Valley, and stimulants. So thanks.
Yeah, drugs also end up playing a larger role in this book than I first imagined. And I think everyone knows, people know a little bit about the LSD history of Palo Alto. That was really one of the like centers of LSD experiments. And it was fun talking about this in Palo Alto because some of the people were like, oh yeah, I remember. Like, like really, I was talking with like the husband of a family friend of mine who's been there forever. This guy Brad, who's a ancient Stanford statistician. He was like, oh, I remember the 60s, and the psychologists, like, they'd go for it. They're just trying to open your mind, man. Like, it was a therapeutic tool. But it was funny because they used it in the 60s. What really excited Palo Alto about LSD was the same thing that excites them about computers, same thing excites them about anything else, which is it's so powerful. They saw this compound and they're like, a little tiny bit can cause the hugest effect. Like, we've never seen a compound so powerful as LSD. This has got to be good for something, right? Like, Silicon Valley's like, we got to put this to work. And so they do it in a couple different ways at the beginning, and one is what we now think of as microdosing, was invented by this guy Willis Harman in the Palo Alto community in Stanford, to do the same thing that it's for now, which is to make tech workers or brain workers, professionals, better at their jobs. And they ran all these experiments where, like, are you a better coder if you drop some acid? Are you better at engineering or like architecture drawing if you drop some acid? And the answer they found was like, yeah, kind of, like maybe a little bit, which I think is still everyone's answer, right? Like maybe. Feels kind of cool. It feels like it might be. But they were also at the same time at the Veterans Hospital on Stanford campus experimenting on a veterans hospital full of disturbed captive, the people who the medical director describes them as very, very quiet. People who had been there since World War I and just sitting quietly in this medical hospital, and giving them LSD as to experiment in generating schizophrenia in people such that you could interrogate them. And so it was a weapon on both sides, right? On one hand, they're trying to increase the power of the American brain workers to improve the American economy, right? To improve engineers so that their engineers can beat the Soviets. And on the other hand, they're experimenting with what can we do with this if we get a Soviet, maybe we can give him a bunch of LSD and he'll tell us everything. And stimulants end up playing a more traditional role, I guess, on the production lines when you get into Silicon Valley, which is you have a number of cases of these big companies, Intel, HP, whatever, provide intentionally setting up systems where they're providing assembly line workers with amphetamines to try and increase their work. And if you read accounts of working in Silicon Valley in the 70s in particular, in the early 80s, everyone is fucking zonked 24/7. And it depends where you are on the hierarchy, which drugs you're on. So if you're a production worker, you're like getting crystal from your boss so that you can like do your work better. And then if you're like management, you're getting a bunch of cocaine, and there's stories about people doing cocaine off like the silicon mirrors that they take from work and like designing potency measuring computer machines. It really becomes this like all like nerd cocaine culture in the 80s, which you don't really think about Palo Alto that way exactly, right? But then you go through this history and it's right there. And that was my experience for a number of different things, right? Not just drugs, but a number of things that you don't associate with Palo Alto, you don't associate with California. And then you look at the history and you're like, well, there it's been the whole time. No wonder it's so weird now. They didn't come up with microdosing yesterday. This has been the capital of microdosing. They didn't come up with gig work yesterday. This was the capital of temp work. They didn't come up with techno-racism today. This was the capital of techno-racism in the early 20th century. And so that's the project of the book, and one that other people, I think, haven't attempted yet. So I think it's a new project, and I hope that people get a bunch out of it. I hope you guys buy it and read it and stuff. Thank you all for having us.
Well, thank you so much. And the book is truly astounding. It's for sale over there. Please pick up a copy if you can.
And I'll be signing them. Where am I going to sign them? Right now. I'm going to sign them right now. I'm going to sign them right